The sound of the slap echoed like a gunshot through the crystal chandeliers. 300 guests froze mid-conversation. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. The string quartet's melody died in confusion. All eyes turned toward the center of the grand ballroom, where Amelia stood, one hand cradling her 8-month belly, the other touching the crimson handprint blooming across her cheek. Standing over her, draped in black silk and diamonds that glittered like broken promises, was Gian. Her hands still hung in the air, fingers trembling with the aftershock of violence. Her smile was sharp, triumphant, designed to cut. "You thought you could have him?" Gian hissed loud enough for the front rows to hear. "You thought a baby would erase what we were?" The crowd held its breath. Some guests reached for their phones. Others stepped back, anticipating the explosion everyone knew was coming. Because standing just 3 feet away, perfectly still in his charcoal gray Italian suit, was Choi Moo-jin, the architect of ruin, the man who once dismantled empires with a phone call, the legend who could collapse a rival's entire existence without ever raising his voice. 7 years ago, they said he could end you with nothing but a signature and a smile. And right now, he was smiling. Not the warm smile he saved for Amelia. Not the soft expression he practiced in the mirror for their daughter who would arrive in 4 weeks. This was something ancient, something surgical. The smile of a man who had just been reminded of a language he thought he'd forgotten. Jian's confidence flickered. Just for a second. Moo-jin moved then, but not toward her. He crossed to Amelia, his movements calm, controlled, terrifyingly gentle. He cupped her face with both hands, inspecting the mark on her skin as if it were a blueprint he needed to memorize. His thumb traced the outline of Jian's violence with the precision of an architect measuring structural damage. "Are you hurt?" His voice was silk over steel. Amelia met his eyes. Despite the shock, despite the sting, she smiled back at him. "I'm okay," she whispered. "We're okay." Moo-jin kissed her forehead, lingering there for 3 full seconds, while the entire ballroom watched. Then he turned to Jian. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. Instead, he walked toward her with his hands open, his posture relaxed. And before Jian could process what was happening, before her bodyguards could react, Moo-jin wrapped his arms around her in what looked like an embrace. To everyone watching, it appeared almost tender. But those close enough could hear his whisper, soft as death against her ear. "Thank you for reminding me who I am." Jian's blood went cold. Moo-jin pulled back, his smile still in place, and adjusted his cufflinks as if nothing had happened. He took Amelia's hand, and together they walked toward the exit. Not rushed, not fleeing, just leaving, like guests who had simply grown tired of the party. Behind them, Jian stood frozen, suddenly aware that she had just made the worst miscalculation of her life. Because the architect of ruin hadn't retired, he'd simply changed his blueprint. And this time, she was the condemned building. But to understand why a mafia boss smiled while his pregnant wife was struck, you need to know the real story. The one that started 7 years ago when Jian left Moo-jin bleeding in an alley, convinced she'd killed the only man who ever terrified her. Welcome to Seoul Africa Stories. Before we begin, take 1 second to like this video and smash that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what the architect builds next. It truly helps the channel grow and allows us to bring you more powerful African stories. Also, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Drop your country flag in the comments. 7 years ago, Choi Moo-jin didn't need weapons. He had something far more devastating: information, patience, and the kind of strategic mind that could see 17 moves ahead while his enemies were still celebrating their first victory. They called him the architect of ruin, and the name wasn't metaphorical. In the underground world of Seoul's organized crime, Moo-jin operated like a master builder in reverse. While other enforcers broke bones and spilled blood in back alleys, Moo-jin studied blueprints, financial records, legal documents, shell companies. He understood that every criminal empire, no matter how powerful, was just a structure, and every structure had a foundation. Find the cracks, apply the right pressure, watch it all come down. His most famous job was the dismantling of the Guak family, operated untouched for 2 decades. Moo-jin didn't fire a single shot. Instead, he spent 6 months as a low-level accountant in one of their front companies, copying files, learning their networks, mapping every transaction. Then he fed it all to 3 different law enforcement agencies: two rival gangs, and one very ambitious prosecutor who'd been looking for a career-making case. The guac empire collapsed in 11 days. Arrests, asset seizures, Interpol raids, internal betrayals as everyone scrambled to cut deals. By day 12, the family patriarch was found dead in his holding cell, and the organization that had seemed invincible simply ceased to exist. Mujin collected his fee and disappeared before anyone realized he'd been the architect of the whole collapse. That was his method. Invisible, surgical, complete. He'd built a reputation that made him both invaluable and terrifying. Crime bosses hired him to eliminate competition. He never asked questions, never showed mercy, never left evidence. He was the ghost who dismantled your life while you were still living in it. And the money? The money poured in like rain. Penthouses, cars, tailored suits that cost more than most people earned in a year. Mujin had everything except the one thing he never realized he wanted, a reason to stop. Then came Jian. She appeared in his life like a calculated risk, which should have been his first warning. Beautiful, sharp-tongued, ambitious. She worked as a broker in the underworld, connecting buyers with sellers, always taking her cut, always playing three angles at once. They met at a private auction where Mujin was acquiring information on a target, and Jian was selling access to a corrupt official. Their attraction was immediate and toxic. Two predators circling each other, testing boundaries, seeing who would blink first. For 2 years, they were inseparable. Partners in crime, lovers in chaos. Jian understood his work in a way no one else could. She didn't flinch at what he did. She celebrated it, encouraged it. Sometimes she even helped him plan. But Mujin made a mistake. He trusted her. The job was supposed to be simple. A Russian syndicate had moved into Seoul, and the local bosses wanted them gone. Mujin's fee, $8 million, half up front. He planned it perfectly, as always. 3 months of preparation. False evidence planted with immigration. Fabricated conflicts between the Russians and their suppliers. A coordinated raid he'd arranged with contacts in the police force. The night before the operation, Mujin made the transfer. $4 million into the escrow account he shared with Jian, because she'd convinced him that combining their resources was smart, strategic, safer. He woke up the next morning to find the account empty. Jian was gone. The money was gone. And waiting for him in his apartment was a single message written in lipstick on his bathroom mirror. "You taught me well." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 6 hours later, when Mujin met with his police contact to confirm the raid, only to walk into an ambush. Jian hadn't just stolen his money. She'd sold him out to the Russians, who'd paid her $5 million for information on the architect who was planning their destruction. They beat him within an inch of his life in an alley behind a shuttered restaurant. 3 men, tire irons, 40 minutes of systematic brutality designed to send a message. When they were done, they left him bleeding in the rain, convinced he'd never survive the night. But Mujin didn't die. He crawled to a doctor he knew, one who owed him a favor and didn't ask questions. 3 broken ribs, shattered collarbone, internal bleeding, 14 stitches across his face. He survived. Barely. And in those long, agonizing weeks of recovery, something in Mujin changed. The rage he expected never came. Instead, lying in that hospital bed, he felt something he'd never experienced before. Exhaustion. Deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. He was 32 years old and realized he'd spent a decade destroying things, buildings, businesses, lives. For what? Money he didn't need? Respect from people he didn't care about? The love of a woman who'd sold him for a price? When he could finally walk again, Mujin made a decision. He liquidated his remaining assets, paid off his debts, and burned every contact list he'd ever maintained. Then he disappeared. Not to hide, but to rebuild. He moved to London under a new name with a clean passport and enrolled in an architecture course at UCL. Actual architecture. The kind that built things instead of destroying them. His instructors were baffled by this intense, quiet Korean man who approached design problems with frightening precision, who could see structural weaknesses in blueprints that everyone else missed. But Mujin wasn't interested in being brilliant. He was interested in being different. He wanted to create something. Anything. He wanted to prove to himself that the skills he'd used to ruin lives could be repurposed for something that mattered. That's where he met Amelia. She walked into his advanced design seminar 15 minutes late, apologizing in an accent that blended British education with West African roots. She carried a portfolio that was chaos and genius in equal measure, buildings that looked like they were growing from the earth rather than imposed upon it, structures that breathed and lived. Mujin, who prided himself on never being surprised, was completely captivated. They were paired on a project designing a community center for a struggling neighborhood in East London, where Mujin approached the work with mathematical precision. Amelia brought intuition and warmth. She talked about buildings as if they had souls, as if architecture was a conversation between space and the people who would inhabit it. "You design like you're afraid of making a mistake," she told him one evening as they worked late in the studio. "Like you're trying to control every variable." "Control prevents failure," Mujin replied, not looking up from his calculations. Amelia laughed. "Control also prevents magic." She leaned over and sketched a curved wall where Mujin had drawn straight lines, added windows where he'd planned solid surfaces, introduced organic flow into his rigid geometry. The design transformed before his eyes from functional to beautiful. "See?" she said softly. "Sometimes the best structures are the ones that leave room for life to happen." Mujin stared at the drawing, then at her. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just learning about architecture. He was learning about the possibility of being someone else entirely. Their romance developed slowly, carefully. Amelia had been hurt before, a previous relationship that had ended badly, though she never gave him details. Mujin, carrying secrets he couldn't share, understood her need for caution. They built trust like they built their designs, one careful choice at a time. 6 months into their relationship, Amelia's firm offered her a partnership. The catch: she'd need to relocate to their Seoul office to oversee a major urban development project. She almost turned it down until Mujin surprised her by suggesting they go together. Now, friends, if you're enjoying this story so far, hit the like button and subscribe to Seoul Africa Stories. And don't forget to comment where you're tuning in from, your city or country. We love seeing our global family. "You know Seoul?" she asked. "I used to," he said. "Long time ago." They moved into a bright apartment in Hanam-dong with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River. Amelia threw herself into her work, designing sustainable housing complexes and green spaces. Mujin took on freelance architectural consultation, careful to stay out of the public eye, using his skills to help small firms solve complex design problems. For 3 years, they built a life, a real life. Dinners with Amelia's colleagues, weekend trips to Jeju Island, plans for the future that included marriage, children, growing old together. Mujin proposed to her in the nursery room of their new house, a space they designed together, filled with soft light and dreams of the family they'd create. When she said yes, Mujin felt something he'd never experienced in all his years as the architect: peace. They married quietly in a small ceremony. Amelia's family flew in from Ghana. Mujin claimed his family was estranged. It was the only lie he allowed himself, because the truth, that everyone who'd known him before was either dead, imprisoned, or would kill him on sight, was impossible to explain. And then, 8 months into Amelia's pregnancy with their daughter, the invitation arrived. A charity gala for arts education, hosted by one of Seoul's most prominent cultural foundations. Amelia's firm was a major sponsor, and her attendance was expected. Mujin, who normally avoided large events, agreed to go because he could see how excited she was. "You'll be bored," Amelia teased as she selected her gown, a stunning African print silk that celebrated her heritage and accommodated her growing belly. "I'll survive," Mujin assured her, choosing his charcoal suit with the same careful precision he applied to everything. What he didn't know was that across the city, Jian had received the same invitation. Jian, who'd built her own empire with the money she'd stolen. Jian, who'd convinced herself that Mujin was dead and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. Jian, who thought she'd won. She arrived at the gala in a black gown that cost more than most cars, diamonds dripping from her wrists and throat like spoils of war. She moved through the crowd collecting admiration, brokering deals, playing the role of the sophisticated businesswoman she'd bought with blood money. Then she saw him. Across the ballroom, standing with his hand on the small of a pregnant woman's back, was Choi Mujin. Alive, thriving, happy. The shock hit Jian like ice water. For 7 years, she'd carried a small kernel of guilt about what she'd done, soothed by the assumption that he probably died from his injuries or disappeared into obscurity. But here he was, looking better than she'd ever seen him. distinguished, content, free. While she was still playing the same games, still hustling in the shadows, still proving herself to men who would never truly respect her. The injustice of it burned. She watched him throughout the evening, noting every gentle touch he gave his wife, every soft smile, every moment of obvious devotion. This wasn't the cold, calculating enforcer she'd known. This was someone who'd moved on. Someone who'd found something better. And Jian, who'd convinced herself that leaving him was the smartest thing she'd ever done, suddenly felt like she'd lost something irreplaceable. Rage and jealousy mixed into something toxic. Before she could stop herself, before she could think it through, Jian was moving across the ballroom. Her heels clicked like counting down seconds. The crowd parted without realizing why. She stopped directly in front of them. "Mujin," she said, his name dripping with false sweetness. After all these years. Mujin turned slowly. His expression didn't change, but Amelia felt his hand tighten slightly on her back. "Jian." His voice was neutral, flat. "I thought you were dead." "Funny," Jian smiled. "I thought the same about you." Amelia looked between them, sensing the history, the tension thick enough to choke on. "Do you two know each other?" "We used to," Mujin said carefully. Jian's eyes slid to Amelia, taking in the elegant gown, the confident posture, the way she stood beside Mujin like she belonged there, like she'd earned something Jian had thrown away. "Is this your wife?" Jian asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes." "How charming." Jian's smile sharpened. "And pregnant. Congratulations. I'm sure you'll be a wonderful father." The word father came out like an insult. Amelia, who'd spent her career navigating rooms full of dismissive men and subtle aggression, recognized danger when she saw it. "Thank you," she said calmly. "We're very excited." "I'm sure you are." Jian took a step closer, invading their space with predatory intent. "Tell me, does she know what you really are, Mujin? Does she know what you've done?" Mujin's jaw tightened. "That's enough." "Is it?" Jian's voice rose just enough for nearby guests to glance over. "Does she know how many lives you've destroyed? How many people disappeared because of you?" Amelia's hand found Mujin's. "I think you should leave." Jian laughed. "You think you can dismiss me? You don't even know who you're standing next to. This man." She never finished the sentence, because what happened next occurred so fast that most guests would later disagree on the exact sequence of events. Jian's hand came up. The slap connected with Amelia's cheek with a crack that silenced the entire ballroom. And Choi Mujin smiled. The silence that followed the slap was absolute. 300 people held their breath as one. Champagne glasses remained suspended. Conversations died mid-word. Even the string quartet, positioned on the elevated platform at the far end of the ballroom, let their bows drift away from their instruments. Hello, fellas and friends. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe, and share it. It really helps us grow and bring you more stories like this. Amelia stood frozen, one hand instinctively cradling her belly, the other rising slowly to touch her cheek, where Jian's handprint was already blooming red against her dark skin. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with shock at the sheer audacity of what had just happened. Jian's hand still hung in the air, her chest heaving with the adrenaline of what she'd done. Her diamonds caught the light from the chandeliers above, scattering fragments of brightness across her face like shattered glass. She looked almost surprised at herself, as if her body had acted before her mind could intervene. But she didn't apologize, didn't step back. Instead, she held her ground, her chin lifted in defiance, waiting for the explosion she knew was coming. Because everyone in that room knew who Choi Moo-jin used to be. The whispers had circulated for years in Seoul's underground, the architect of ruin, the ghost who dismantled empires. The man who'd once had 3 rival enforcers removed in a single night, their organizations collapsed within a week. Stories about him had taken on mythic proportions, that he never raised his voice, that he could ruin you with a phone call, that crossing him was signing your own end. Some guests near the front were already backing away, anticipating chaos. Others reached for their phones, torn between fleeing and capturing what might be the most dramatic moment of Seoul's social season. A few of the older men, those who remembered the underworld's brutal hierarchy, exchanged knowing glances that said the same thing. That woman just ended herself. They waited for Moo-jin to lunge forward, to grab Jian by the throat, to drag her outside where the real reckoning would happen, away from witnesses and cameras. Instead, Moo-jin smiled. It was a small expression. barely a curve of his lips, the kind of smile that wouldn't look out of place in a business meeting or a casual conversation. But to anyone watching closely, and everyone was watching, there was something deeply wrong about it. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Those remained cold, analytical, measuring. He looked at Jian the way an architect might study a condemned building, calculating load-bearing walls and optimal demolition points. Then, without a word, without acknowledging the 300 people staring at him, Mujin turned his back on Jian. He moved to Amelia with movements so controlled they seemed almost mechanical. His hands came up gently, cupping her face with a tenderness that felt obscene in its contrast to what had just occurred. His thumbs traced the edges of the handprint on her cheek with the precision of someone documenting evidence. "Are you hurt?" His voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for her. Amelia's shock was giving way to something else. Not fear, but a deep, instinctive understanding that the man she'd married was currently holding himself back from something terrible. She could feel it in the tension of his hands, see it in the rigid set of his shoulders beneath his perfectly tailored suit. "I'm okay," she whispered back, though her voice shook slightly. "The baby's okay. We're okay." Mujin closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing her words, letting them anchor him to something. When he opened them again, there was relief there, but also something colder. A decision made. He kissed her forehead, letting his lips linger there for 3 long seconds while the entire ballroom watched. It was an intimate gesture made public, a statement that said more than words ever could. "This is what matters. This is what I protect." Then he turned back to Jian. The crowd tensed. This was it. The moment when the architect of ruin would emerge from retirement and remind everyone why that name had once inspired such fear. But Mujin didn't attack. He walked toward Jian slowly, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture almost casual. There was no rage in his movements, no visible anger, just a calm, purposeful approach that was somehow more frightening than any display of fury could have been. Jian's confidence flickered. She'd expected screaming, chaos, the kind of explosive reaction that would validate her action, that would prove Mujin was still the person she remembered. Instead, he looked at her with something like pity. "Jian," he said softly when he was close enough that only she and a few nearby guests could hear. "You shouldn't have come here." "I have every right," she started, but the words died in her throat as Mujin stepped closer. And then, to the absolute shock of everyone watching, he embraced her. His arms wrapped around her in what appeared to be a gesture of forgiveness, possibly even reconciliation. To the guests at the back of the ballroom, it might have looked like 2 old friends reconnecting. To those closer, it seemed bizarre, inappropriate, impossible to interpret. But Jian, pressed against his chest, heard what no one else could. "Thank you," Mujin whispered against her ear, his voice so soft it was almost gentle. "Thank you for reminding me who I am." Jian's blood turned to ice. She tried to pull back, but his arms held her in place, not forcefully, but firmly. A reminder that despite his smile, despite his calm demeanor, he was still stronger than her. "You made a mistake 7 years ago," he continued in that same terrifying whisper. "You thought you destroyed me. You thought you won, but all you did was teach me patience." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his smile still in place. The architect never left Jian. He just learned to build prisons instead of graves. He released her then, stepping back with a final, gentle pat on her shoulder that to observers might have looked friendly, but to Jian felt like a judge's gavel coming down. Mujin turned away, offered his arm to Amelia, and together they walked toward the exit. Not rushing, not fleeing, walking with the measured pace of people who had simply decided the evening was over. The crowd parted for them like water. No one spoke. No one moved to stop them. They simply watched as Mujin and Amelia disappeared through the grand doors, leaving Jian standing alone in the center of the ballroom, suddenly aware that she had miscalculated catastrophically. The whispers started before the doors even closed behind them. Mujin drove Amelia directly to the hospital, despite her protests that she was fine. He sat beside her in the examination room, holding her hand while a doctor checked her blood pressure, listened to the baby's heartbeat, ran through a series of questions designed to assess trauma. "Everything looks normal," the doctor finally announced. "The baby's heartbeat is strong, no signs of distress, but I want you to rest for the next few days. No stress, no excitement." Amelia nodded, relief flooding her features. But when she looked at Mujin, she saw that his expression hadn't changed. He still wore that small, cold smile. Mujin, she said softly after the doctor left. Who was she? He was silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Someone from my past, someone I should have told you about. Did you love her? I thought I did. Once. He met Amelia's eyes, and for the first time since the slap, his expression softened into something genuine. But I didn't know what love was until I met you. Amelia studied his face, seeing the truth there, but also seeing something else. A darkness she'd never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. What are you going to do? Mujin's smile returned. Take you home. Make sure you rest. Take care of you and our daughter. That's not what I'm asking. He stood, helping her off the examination table with infinite gentleness. I know. They drove home in silence. Mujin helped Amelia into bed, brought her water and the pregnancy pillow she preferred, kissed her forehead with the same tenderness he'd shown at the gala. I love you, he whispered. Nothing that happens changes that. Amelia caught his hand before he could leave the room. Mujin, whatever you're planning. Rest, he interrupted gently. That's all you need to think about. Rest and taking care of our baby. He waited until her breathing deepened into sleep before he moved. Then he walked to his study, closed the door, and opened the locked drawer of his desk that Amelia had never asked about. Inside were 3 phones he hadn't used in 7 years. Burners with encrypted SIM cards, registered to names that didn't exist, connected to networks that operated in the spaces between legal and illegal. Mujin powered on the first phone and waited. Within 30 seconds, it began to vibrate with messages, automated alerts from accounts he'd set up as insurance policies before he disappeared. Digital tripwires he'd planted throughout Seoul's underground infrastructure, designed to notify him if certain names ever surfaced in official databases or business networks. And there, among the accumulated 7 years of silent alerts, was Jian's name, highlighted dozens of times. Police reports, business registrations, property acquisitions. She hadn't just survived, she thrived. Mujin began to read, his architectural mind organizing information into structures he could analyze. Within an hour, he had a preliminary blueprint of Jian's current life. She ran an import-export business that was clearly a front for questionable activities. She had connections to 3 separate organizations, providing logistics and financial services. She'd invested the money she'd stolen from him, his money, into real estate across Southeast Asia, creating a network of holdings that generated legitimate income while hiding illegal operations. She'd built an empire on his supposed end, or what she thought was his end. The second phone connected him to a secure forum he'd once used to communicate with information brokers. His old login still worked, another insurance policy. He posted a single encrypted message. The architect needs structural analysis. Target, Jian. Timeline, 72 hours. Budget, unlimited. The response came within minutes. 3 brokers accepted the job simultaneously, competing for his business like sharks sensing blood in water. They remembered him. They remembered what it meant when the architect requested information. By morning, his email, routed through 6 proxy servers, contained 18 files. Financial records that Jian thought were hidden. Photographs of her meeting with known questionable figures. Voice recordings of conversations that proved she was still actively involved in illegal operations. Partnership agreements that outlined exactly how her empire was structured and where its vulnerabilities lay. Mujin spread the information across his desk like blueprints, seeing not just what Jian had built, but how it would fall. Every business had a foundation. Every foundation had cracks. His job was simply to find them and apply pressure. Her import-export company relied on bribing customs officials. 2 officials, specifically, whose names appeared repeatedly in the communications logs, removed them, and her entire supply chain would collapse under scrutiny. Her real estate holdings were financed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, managed by a single law firm in Hong Kong that specialized in helping people hide assets. But that law firm was currently under investigation by international authorities for unrelated matters. One anonymous tip connecting Jian's holdings to their practices would trigger a cascade of legal freezes. Her partnerships with questionable organizations were held together by mutual profit, but also by her reputation as someone trustworthy, someone who kept secrets. What would happen if those secrets suddenly became public? If her partners discovered she'd once betrayed the architect himself for money? The structure was clear now. Mujin could see exactly how to bring it down. He spent the second day making calls on his third phone, reaching out to contacts he'd thought he'd never speak to again. A prosecutor who'd once taken information from Mujin to build career-making cases. A forensic accountant who specialized in unraveling questionable financial networks. A journalist known for exposing corruption in high places. None of them questioned why the architect had suddenly reappeared after 7 years of silence. They simply listened to his offers, information they could use, cases they could crack, stories they could break, and agreed to act. Mujin didn't tell them about the slap, didn't mention his pregnant wife or his desire for justice. He simply presented opportunities, positioned as mutually beneficial arrangements. The prosecutor would get arrest statistics and positive press. The accountant would receive a substantial consulting fee. The journalist would break a major story about questionable networks operating in Seoul's business sector. They would do the work. They would take the credit. And Jian would collapse under the weight of their investigation without ever knowing who had really orchestrated her destruction. On the third day, Mujin activated the final piece of his plan. He sent an anonymous package to Jian's largest business partner, an organization based in Macau that relied on her logistics network. Inside the package was evidence that Jian had been skimming profits, a complete fabrication Mujin had constructed using her own financial records, altered just enough to suggest betrayal without being obviously fake. Questionable organizations didn't investigate accusations. They simply acted. And when your reputation was built on trustworthiness, even a hint of betrayal was fatal. Mujin spent those 3 days playing the role of devoted husband. He made Amelia breakfast in bed, rubbed her feet when she complained about swelling, sat with her in the nursery they'd designed together, discussing names for their daughter and plans for her future. Amelia watched him carefully, seeing the contrast between his gentle care and the cold calculation she'd glimpsed at the gala. She didn't ask what he was doing during the hours he spent in his study. She simply held his hand when he returned to her and chose to trust the man she'd married. On the morning of the fourth day, Mujin's phone, his real phone, the one registered to his current identity, buzzed with a news alert. Prominent businesswoman arrested in multi-million-dollar case. The article included a photo of Jian being led away in handcuffs, her expression caught between shock and fury. The story detailed how a joint investigation by prosecutors and international authorities had uncovered a massive operation hidden within her import-export business. Her assets were frozen. Her associates were turning on her, providing evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. Her partners in Macau had publicly disavowed any connection to her. Jian's empire, built over 7 years with his money and his blood, had collapsed in 72 hours. Mujin read the article twice, then deleted the notification. He walked to the kitchen where Amelia was attempting to make breakfast despite his repeated offers to do it for her. "It's done," he said quietly. Amelia turned to him, one hand on her belly, the other holding a spatula. "The woman from the gala? She won't bother us again." "Did you?" She stopped, reconsidering the question. "Should I ask?" Mujin crossed to her, taking the spatula and setting it aside so he could hold both her hands. "I didn't hurt her. I didn't threaten her. I just built a case. Let the system do what the system does." "But you built the case." "Yes." Amelia searched his face, seeing the truth there, that the gentleman who'd spent 3 days caring for her was also capable of dismantling someone's entire existence with the same precision he applied to architectural designs. "Is this who you were?" she asked. "Before?" "This is who I was," Mujin confirmed, "but it's not who I want to be." "Then why did you do it?" His hands tightened slightly on hers. "Because she hit you. Because she threatened our family. Because some structures need to be demolished before you can build something better." They stood in silence for a long moment, the morning sun streaming through their kitchen window, the smell of slightly burnt eggs filling the air. Finally, Amelia spoke. "No more secrets." "No more secrets," Mujin agreed, "and no more dismantling people's lives." He smiled, a real smile this time, warm and genuine. "Unless they hit my wife." Despite everything, Amelia laughed. She pulled him close, her pregnant belly pressed between them, and kissed him with the fierce tenderness of someone choosing love despite its complications. "You're retiring the architect," she said. "Again, permanently this time." "Permanently," he promised. "I just needed to close one last project." And in a holding cell across the city, Jian sat staring at the concrete walls of her prison, finally understanding what she'd lost 7 years ago when she'd left Mujin for gone. Not just his love, not just his protection, the chance to be something more, the possibility of building instead of destroying, the opportunity to become someone who created beautiful things instead of someone who consumed them. The architect had taught her a final lesson. The most devastating ruins aren't physical structures. They're the lives we destroy trying to prove we're strong enough to survive alone. The 72 hours that followed the Gala incident unfolded in two parallel realities. In one reality, Choi Moo-jin was the perfect, expectant father. He woke before Amelia each morning, preparing ginger tea to help with her nausea and arranging fresh fruit on a plate with the same precision he'd once used to plan operations. He accompanied her to prenatal appointments, asking the doctor questions about fetal development with genuine fascination. In the evenings, he sat beside her on the couch, one hand resting protectively on her belly, reading parenting books with the focus of a man studying for the most important exam of his life. But in another reality, one that existed in the blue glow of computer screens in his locked study, in encrypted phone calls made while Amelia slept, in the careful reconstruction of a skill set he'd promised himself he'd never use again, Moo-jin was executing the most precise demolition of his career. The prosecutor's name was Kim Yun-woo, and she was exactly the kind of weapon Moo-jin needed: ambitious, incorruptible, and hungry for a case that would make her career. 7 years ago, when Moo-jin was still operating in the shadows, he'd fed her information about a business ring that she'd successfully prosecuted, earning her a promotion and a reputation as someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. She owed him. More importantly, she remembered him. The first package arrived at her office on hour 6 of Moo-jin's operation. No return address, no note, just a USB drive containing financial records for Jian's import-export company, records that showed a pattern of wire transfers that matched known illegal techniques. The amounts were too precise to be legitimate business. The timing correlated with known questionable activity in 3 countries. Prosecutor Kim would recognize the pattern immediately. She'd also recognize the signature, the particular way the information was organized, the specific details highlighted, the breadcrumb trail that led from suspicious transactions to concrete evidence of illegal activity. This was how the architect used to work. He'd returned. On hour 12, while Moo-jin was making Amelia lunch and listening to her talk about the sustainable housing project her firm was developing, Prosecutor Kim was presenting the USB drive contents to her superior. Within 90 minutes, she had authorization to open a preliminary investigation. On hour 24, while Moo-jin was rubbing Amelia's swollen feet and researching the best car seats for newborns, Kim's team was interviewing the customs officials whose names appeared repeatedly in Jian's communications logs. One official, younger and more frightened than the other, broke within 40 minutes. Yes, he'd accepted payments. Yes, he could provide documentation. Yes, he would testify in exchange for immunity. The foundation was cracking. On hour 36, the second package arrived at Kim's office. This one contained evidence of Jian's real estate holdings, property records for 17 buildings across Southeast Asia, all purchased through shell companies, all showing the hallmarks of asset concealment. More importantly, the package included communication logs between Jian and the Hong Kong law firm that managed these holdings, communications that explicitly discussed hiding proceeds. Prosecutor Kim smiled when she saw this. The architect wasn't just giving her a case, he was giving her an empire to dismantle, piece by carefully documented piece. On hour 48, while Moo-jin was installing a mobile above their daughter's crib, delicate paper cranes he and Amelia had folded together, each one representing a hope for their child's future, Kim was coordinating with international authorities. The Hong Kong law firm was already under investigation for unrelated matters. Adding Jian's holdings to that investigation would create a cascade effect, freezing assets across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. On hour 54, Moo-jin made a phone call to a journalist named Park Min-jun, a man who'd built his career exposing corruption in Seoul's business sector. The conversation was brief, professional, and appeared to be about nothing more consequential than a general discussion of financial irregularities in Korea. But embedded in that conversation were three specific details: the name of Jian's company, the dates of certain suspicious transactions, and a suggestion that someone with investigative skills might find the public business registrations for that company quite interesting. Park Min-jun had made his career by following such suggestions. Within 6 hours, he'd filed information requests with 4 government agencies and begun mapping the network of companies connected to Jian's primary business. On hour 60, while Mu Jin was reading bedtime stories to Amelia's belly, a nightly ritual that made her laugh and made him feel connected to the daughter he hadn't yet met, Jian was receiving the first indication that something was wrong. Her accountant called in a panic. 2 of their shell companies had been flagged for audit. The Hong Kong law firm wasn't returning calls. The customs official who'd been on their payroll for 3 years had suddenly resigned without explanation. Jian wasn't worried yet. Problems arose in her line of work. They could be managed, contained, solved with money or intimidation or both. She'd built her empire by being smarter and more ruthless than her competitors. A few audits weren't going to bring her down. She had no idea she was living in a building whose foundations had already been removed, held up only by momentum and ignorance, seconds away from collapse. On hour 66, the third package arrived at Prosecutor Kim's office. This one was different. Not just evidence of Jian's activities, but evidence of her partnerships. Names, dates, transaction records connecting her to 3 separate questionable organizations. Most devastating of all, evidence that she'd been skimming profits from her largest partner, the Macau organization that provided most of her business. This evidence was fabricated, but Mu Jin had constructed it so carefully, using Jian's own financial records as the foundation, that it would take a forensic accountant weeks to identify the alterations. And in the business underworld, accusations didn't require proof. They only required plausibility. Prosecutor Kim understood immediately what the architect had done. He wasn't just giving her the target. He was isolating the target, cutting off every possible avenue of support or escape. By the time Jian realized she was under investigation, she'd also be fighting on 2 fronts: law enforcement ahead of her and her own business partners behind her. Kim had prosecuted hundreds of people in her career. She'd seen every defense, every escape attempt, every desperate gambit. But she'd never seen anyone as thoroughly trapped as Jian was about to be. On hour 68, Prosecutor Kim made her move. She filed for emergency asset freezes across 7 jurisdictions simultaneously. She coordinated with international authorities to flag Jian's passport. She issued subpoenas to 4 banks, 3 law firms, and 17 individuals connected to Jian's business network. And then she scheduled a press conference. On hour 70, while Mu Jin was making breakfast and discussing baby names with Amelia, they'd narrowed it down to 3 choices, each one representing a different hope for their daughter's character. Park Min-jun published his article, The Hidden Empire: How One Sole Businesswoman Built a Network Worth Hundreds of Millions. The article was devastating, meticulously researched, impossible to dismiss as speculation because every claim was backed by public records, albeit records that required expertise to interpret correctly. The article didn't explicitly accuse Jian of wrongdoing. Park was too experienced for that, but it asked all the right questions, drew all the right connections, and left readers with an unmistakable impression. This woman was operating outside the law, and authorities should investigate. The article went viral within 2 hours. News stations picked it up. Business networks discussed it. Social media exploded with commentary and speculation. By hour 71, Jian's phone was ringing constantly. Partners demanding explanations, lawyers advising immediate action, associates distancing themselves with transparent urgency. And then came the call that made her blood run cold. Her Macau partner, informing her in a voice like frozen steel that their arrangement was terminated, effective immediately, and she should consider herself fortunate that termination was all they were imposing. They'd seen the evidence of her alleged skimming. They didn't care if it was true. In their world, the accusation itself was enough. Jian stood in her luxury apartment, purchased with money she'd stolen from Mu Jin 7 years ago, and felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't bad luck. This was coordinated, precise, surgical. This was architecture. And she knew, with sudden and absolute certainty, who the architect was. On hour 72 exactly, Jian held her own press conference. It was a desperate move, an attempt to control the narrative before law enforcement could. Her PR team had arranged it quickly, booking a hotel conference room, inviting journalists, preparing a statement that portrayed her as a legitimate businesswoman being unfairly targeted by unnamed enemies with ulterior motives. She wore white, a deliberate choice meant to project innocence. Her makeup was flawless. Her statement was carefully crafted to express outrage without acknowledging any specific accusations. She was the picture of wrong dignity, prepared to fight these baseless allegations. She never got to deliver the statement. Prosecutor Kim walked into the conference room, flanked by 6 police officers, holding an arrest warrant and wearing an expression of professional satisfaction. The cameras that were supposed to capture Jian's defense instead captured her arrest, broadcasting it live to news networks across Korea. Jian, Kim announced clearly, making sure every microphone caught her words, "You're under arrest for tax evasion, conspiracy to commit various offenses, and operating an illegal enterprise. You have the right to remain silent." Jian's carefully constructed facade shattered. She looked directly at the cameras, at the journalists who'd come to hear her side of the story, at the public who would now only remember this moment, and felt 7 years of careful building collapse in an instant. As the officers placed handcuffs on her wrists, as her lawyers began shouting objections that everyone ignored, as the cameras flashed and the questions flew, Jian understood exactly what had happened. Mujin hadn't used force, hadn't hired anyone to harm her, hadn't relied on the brutal tactics that had once made him legendary in Seoul's underworld. Instead, he'd used the very systems she'd spent her career evading: law enforcement, financial regulation, public scrutiny, and turned them into weapons more devastating than any physical threat. The architect hadn't built her a prison. He'd revealed that she'd been living in one all along, and simply locked the doors she'd never noticed existed. That evening, Mujin sat in the nursery, watching the paper cranes turn slowly in the air conditioning's gentle current. Each crane represented a promise: love, safety, opportunity, freedom. The same things he'd lacked as a child, the same things he'd destroyed as the architect, the same things he was trying to build for his daughter. Amelia stood in the doorway, watching him. She'd been quiet since the news broke, processing the reality that the woman who'd slapped her was now facing decades in prison, that her husband had somehow orchestrated this downfall while simultaneously being the most attentive partner she'd ever had. "We need to talk," she said softly. Mujin nodded without turning around. "I know." She crossed the room and sat beside him on the floor, her pregnancy making the movement awkward but determined. "Tell me everything. No edited version. No protecting me, everything." So he did. He told her about growing up in poverty in Busan, about joining an organization at 15 because it was the only family structure that would have him. He told her about discovering his talent for pattern recognition, for seeing how systems worked and how they could be manipulated. He told her about becoming the architect of ruin, about the money and the power and the consequences that resulted from his work, even if he never directly caused harm himself. He told her about Jian, the relationship built on mutual ambition, the betrayal that nearly ended him, the decision to walk away from everything and become someone different. "I thought I could just be someone else," Mujin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought love and good intentions would be enough, that I could bury who I was so deep it would never resurface." "But she brought it back," Amelia said. "No." Mujin finally looked at her, his eyes honest and raw in a way she'd never seen. "I brought it back. The moment she hit you, I made a choice. I could have walked away, reported her to police, handled it through legitimate channels without using my old networks. But I didn't. I chose to be the architect one more time. Why? Because it was efficient. Because I knew I could guarantee the outcome. Because..." He paused, struggling with the admission. "Because part of me wanted to prove I still could. That becoming a good man didn't mean becoming a weak one." Amelia was silent for a long moment, her hand resting on her belly where their daughter was shifting, perhaps sensing the tension in her mother's body. "Are you sorry you did it?" Mujin considered the question carefully. "I'm sorry I lied to you about who I was." I'm sorry I built our relationship on an incomplete truth. But am I sorry Jian is in custody? No. She was still operating illegally. She was still hurting people. What I did? It was justice, just not the kind administered fairly. And if she'd been innocent, if she'd actually become legitimate, then none of my evidence would have held up. The prosecutors would have found nothing to charge her with. The investigation would have cleared her. He met Amelia's eyes. I didn't frame her. I just made sure her activities were impossible to hide. Amelia absorbed this, trying to reconcile the gentleman who read stories to her pregnant belly with the calculating enforcer who dismantled an empire in 72 hours. What happens now? That depends on you. On me? Mujin took her hand, his grip gentle but his gaze intense. I can't promise I'll never use those skills again. If someone threatens our family, if someone puts you or our daughter in danger, I will do whatever is necessary to protect you. But I can promise that I'm done with that world. No more networks, no more operations, no more being the architect for hire. Just the architect for family, Amelia said. Yes. She studied his face, seeing both the man she'd fallen in love with and the man she'd never fully known, understanding that they weren't separate people but different expressions of the same complicated human being. I need time to process this. I understand, but I'm not leaving. She placed his hand on her belly where their daughter was kicking, a reminder of the future they'd built together. I'm angry that you lied. I'm disturbed by what you did. But I also watched that woman hit me and threaten the life we've built, and I can't honestly say I'm sorry she's facing consequences. Mujin felt something unknot in his chest. Not relief exactly, but the loosening of a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. I don't deserve you. Probably not. Amelia agreed with a slight smile. But you're stuck with me anyway, for better or worse, including whatever complicated worse this situation represents. They sat together in the nursery, surrounded by the hopes they'd folded into paper cranes, and chose to move forward rather than backward. Not because the past was forgotten, but because the future they were building seemed worth the complications of the present. 4 weeks later, Amelia went into labor. The delivery was long and difficult, 18 hours of contractions and breathing exercises, and Mujin holding her hand with a grip that suggested he was the one in pain. But when their daughter finally arrived, small and perfect and screaming with the outrage of someone forced to leave a comfortable place before she was ready, Mujin felt something shift inside himself that he couldn't articulate. This was what he'd built. Not an empire of fear, but a tiny human who would depend on him for everything, who would learn about the world through his example, who would grow up never knowing the chaos and desperation that had shaped his early years. They named her Sarah, after Amelia's grandmother who'd been an activist in Ghana, fighting for education rights until she was 87. A name that meant princess, but that carried weight and history and the expectation of strength. Mujin held his daughter in the hospital room, studying her tiny fingers and the way her eyes tried to focus on his face, and made a silent promise. She would never know the architect of ruin. She would only know her father. Imperfect, complicated, but devoted entirely to her well-being. 6 weeks after Sarah's birth, a letter arrived at their house. It was postmarked from Jeju Correctional Facility, where Jian was awaiting trial. The envelope was thin, containing only a single page of handwriting that Mujin recognized immediately. He stood in his study, holding the envelope, debating whether to open it. Amelia was in the living room with Sarah, singing softly while their daughter fought sleep with the determination of someone who refused to miss a single moment of existence. He could hear them through the door, his wife's voice, his daughter's small noises of protest and contentment. That was his life now. That was what mattered. Mujin crossed to the fireplace they rarely used, struck a match, and held it to the corner of the envelope without opening it. He watched the paper catch, watched Jian's words, whatever they were, apology or threat or plea, curl and blacken and disappear into ash. He'd spent 7 years running from his past, then 72 hours returning to it. But this moment, burning a letter unread, felt like the true ending. Not because he was pretending the past didn't exist, but because he was choosing not to let it define his present. The architect of ruin was gone. Not forgotten, Mujin would carry those memories and that skill set for the rest of his life, available if his family ever needed protection but locked away otherwise, but no longer the defining feature of his identity. He was just a father now, a husband, a man trying to build something beautiful instead of demolishing what others had created. From the living room, Amelia called out, "Mujin?" Sarah finally fell asleep. "Come see how peaceful she looks." He watched the last corner of the envelope burn away, then brushed the ashes from his hands and walked toward his family. Behind him, the past turned to smoke. Ahead of him, his daughter slept peacefully, knowing nothing of prisons or betrayals or the complicated man who would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of her trust. Some structures needed to be demolished before you could build something better. But the best construction happened not by destroying what came before, but by learning from it, adapting, creating something entirely new from the lessons of collapsed foundations. Mujin had been the architect of ruin. Now he was simply an architect, building a life one careful choice at a time, hoping that love and intention would be strong enough to support the weight of everything that came before. In her crib, Sarah shifted and sighed, dreaming infant dreams untouched by her father's history. And Mujin watched her breathe and thought that maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about refusing to let it design the future. The last ash from Jian's letter dissolved in the fireplace. The apartment was quiet except for Sarah's gentle breathing and the city sounds filtering through the windows. Amelia reached for Mujin's hand, and for the first time in 7 years, maybe for the first time in his entire life, Choi Mujin felt truly free. He looked at his wife, at his sleeping daughter, at the home they'd created together through patience and trust and the willingness to forgive complicated truths. This was his architecture now. Not the destruction of enemies, but the construction of family. Not the dismantling of empires, but the building of a single, precious life that would grow and flourish in the safety he'd provide. Sarah made a small sound in her sleep, and both parents turned to watch her. Mujin thought about all the choices that had led him here, the terrible ones and the redemptive ones, the violence and the healing, the person he'd been and the person he was becoming. "What are you thinking?" Amelia whispered. "That I spent years tearing things down," Mujin said softly. "But this," he gestured to Sarah, to their home, to the life they'd created, "this is the only thing I've ever built that matters." Amelia squeezed his hand. "Then let's keep building." And they did, day by day, choice by choice, brick by careful brick, building a family, building trust, building a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. The architect had learned his final lesson. The most important structures aren't the ones that inspire fear. They're the ones that create shelter, that protect what's precious, that stand as monuments not to power, but to love. Love this story? Tell us in the comments which part resonated with you most. We read every response, and your feedback helps us create better content. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next tale of transformation and second chances. Today's lesson from Mujin's journey. The strongest foundation isn't built on revenge or power. It's built on the courage to change, the wisdom to protect what matters, and the strength to create rather than destroy. True power isn't about how many structures you can tear down. It's about what you choose to build in their place.